My name is Michael Katsillis, and with Romain Delès, we are going to talk to you today about inequality, its impact on status attainment, and the motivations of social reproduction and mobility. In this study, we focus on the gender gap in mathematics, understanding how it ties into educational and social selection, and the importance of continuing to evolve our understanding of the phenomenon by keeping an open mind with regard to theoretical innovation. Now, as societies evolve, they strive for greater efficiency and meritocracy. Education acts as a mechanism of social selection via both educational attainment and later overall status attainment. We, as a society, are okay with this because we largely perceive education as being meritocratic. Meritocracy, however, presupposes that we all start out fundamentally equal, which is to say we are all, at least initially, treated equally by the educational mechanism. Theoretically, as societies develop, they also become more egalitarian. So women are proposed to have increased educational opportunity. And indeed, they stay in education longer and have increased access to its highest levels. Careful examination, or really just paying attention to the world around us, shows us that despite this, women do worse in STEM, apply for fewer STEM degrees, and take less positions within STEM fields. These positions, however, are among, if not the most highly rewarding fields, in terms of both income and, within the gamut of relevant positions, status. That disparity, however, paints gender as a structural impediment for students, shaping gender inequalities throughout society and the life course. So, understanding the underlying causes and motivations of the gender gap in mathematics becomes a critical issue in examinations of social mobility, social reproduction, social and educational policy in general, and, of course, gender equality in particular. Now, the overwhelming majority of the literature interprets the gender gap in mathematics through what is referred to as gender stratification theory, which posits the gender gap in mathematics as the result of rational choices made by students after they weigh anticipated future opportunities that appear within the public sphere, resulting in differential effort on their part. So, once more, in theory, students observe society, where they perceive differential opportunities based on gender, and invest the corresponding differential degree of effort into their studies. This theoretical approach to the gender gap in mathematics is so widely accepted that for more than 3 decades it has been the lens through which all other explanations are interpreted. Other theories can explain aspects thereof or function within the bounds of gender stratification theory, but are not, to our knowledge, ever seriously examined as alternative explanations. But the reality is that gendered behaviors and the perception of gender are not just the purview of the public sphere. The formation of gender identities and gendered behavior starts early in life. So too does the gender gap in mathematics. So early, in fact, that we argue these anticipated opportunities are a thing of the distant future, ostensibly off students' radar at that point. So early, indeed, that students should still be internalizing gendered behaviors and identities from their home and family environments. So we wonder if this cannot be reasonably due to the influence of the public sphere. Can it possibly be explained via their gender socialization? In other words, can students' gendered behaviors, including mathematics performance, be attributed to the interpretation of gender equality and the internalization of gender roles in the domestic sphere at these early ages? We think this is worth looking into. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that gendered achievement disparities are not necessarily consistent across the performance distribution. In fact, they rarely are. Boys tend to achieve overall higher scores at the upper end of the distribution. Girls tend to score better than boys around the median and or mean achievement marks, and the lower end is frequently all over the place. As such, average performance differences are not always anywhere near as descriptive a summary measure here as they are in other cases. However, since we know that there are disparities among the highest achievers, we can alternatively model the gender gap in mathematics as the relative scarcity of girls in the highest achievement brackets, which is to say, as a binary construct. Are students in the highest bracket or not? We can then model this in a logistic regression, which we can use to compare across countries, controlling for both individual and country level characteristics, and so on. The downside to this is, as anyone conversant in multi-level modeling will tell you, that there are never enough countries to satisfy the requirements of multi-level modeling. Theory tells us we should ideally have 50 level 2 groups, which in this case means countries. The minimum suggested number is 35. And this works in a lot of multi-level research where groups can be things like schools or cities. But there are a limited number of countries in the world, an even more limited number of surveys that collect data on them, and even in the best of cases, surveys rarely if ever have comprehensive data on all of their data points. So what do? Well, we cheat. Sort of. We run individual level logistic regressions, but we include binary dummy variables for each country. These approximate the country level fixed effects we would normally attempt to model into our multi-level models. They attempt to account for the otherwise unexplained variance within countries. We also include individual level characteristics with well-established ties to educational achievement, things like family socioeconomic status, parental and student educational expectations, gender obviously, and so on and so forth. Of course, at this point, you may be wondering, if you're not reading ahead, if this is an individual level model I'm talking about, how are we examining country level effects meaningfully? Well, the workaround necessitated by these limitations is that we can only examine them as they function through individual level characteristics. We call these expressions of big country level characteristics through student level characteristics cross-level interactions, and these are, in effect, what we are really interested in here. And since we're specifically interested in the gender gap in mathematics, what we're actually interested in is cross-level interactions with student gender, which would allow us to directly examine country-level public, domestic, and societal inequalities, gendered or otherwise, through student gender. To examine stratification theory, we include the public sphere gender equality measures, including things like women's labor force participation, women's political empowerment, the gender gap index, the wage gap, and so forth. And to expand our examination to include and examine the socialization effect, we include cross-level interactions with domestic gender equality measures, which are primarily comprised of different aspects of the distribution of unpaid time, housework, and care activities between parents. Increased equality in these behaviors can decrease or even reverse gendered behaviors in young children, and there's evidence to show that these are good proxies for gender equality, or inequality as the case may be, in the home and or family environment. We've actually got some really interesting references to some quite nice papers that deal precisely with these issues in our paper. But that's not all. There's now evidence to suggest that general, which is to say societal inequality, amplifies gender inequalities. The proxy for societal inequality, in this case, was, and is for us as well, the Gini coefficient, a measure of statistical dispersion whose purpose has alternatively been to represent wealth, income, or consumption inequalities. Fundamentally, societal inequalities at large. This relationship, this amplification, seems robust, but its examinations have been limited to models controlling for public sphere gender equality. Before we can meaningfully delve into expanding or even challenging the established paradigm, we really need to check if this relationship is comprehensive to all forms of gender equality, which is, in this case, to say, if the amplification persists when we model the gender gap in mathematics using domestic gender equality measures as well as public gender equality measures. Of course, to examine all of this, we first need data that contains the type of information we need. In our case, the TIMSS 2019 cohort, which has extensive data on students from 64 countries, a reasonable set of sociodemographic characteristics, early life information, and data from two separate cohorts, which is to say both younger, grade 4, ages 9 to 10, and older, grade 8, ages 13 to 14, roughly students. Sadly, while TIMSS 2019 collected data from 64 countries, not all of these countries included key sociodemographic markers, and not all of those that did had reliable domestic gender equality data available, despite our scraping multiple sources, including the OECD, the UN, and the ISSP databases. However, Smaller samples may facilitate homogeneity of variance on the issues we care about, which is to say things like sociocultural characteristics related to the gender gap in mathematics, gendered behaviors, and gender policy within countries. So, in an attempt to both maximize contiguity, hopefully facilitating interpretable, meaningful results, and limit heterogeneity, we limited ourselves to a socioculturally contiguous sample of European countries. This left us with a total of 24 countries. Amazingly, still not the smallest sample in comparable examinations. We had 18 in grade 4 and 11 in grade 8, although I'm limiting myself to the grade 4 results in today's presentation as they were both more unexpected and, we think, more interesting. We estimated our models, both with and without controlling for societal inequality, which is to say, the Gini coefficient. Among the younger students represented here in the 18 countries across Europe, societal inequalities substantially amplified the role of domestic gender equality in predicting the gender gap in mathematics. We've modeled the gender gap in mathematics here as the ratio of students at or above the high TIMSS achievement threshold, which is to say a score of 550 or better, inclusive of high and advanced TIMSS achievement. This was also the closest equivalent to the much more pervasive category 5-6 distinction used in studies that employ PISA data. We've limited the report to just the core indicators, the three most prevalent public gender equality measures and the primary representatives of the domestic gender equality measures. In this case, that means the OECD measurements, which we've employed as such because they are both the most widely available and consistently measured versions of these characteristics across all countries. The results, however, are robust across multiple achievement thresholds, both relative and absolute, and a fair number of alternative measurements and data sources. They say, however, that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So in this slide, I am being exceedingly long-winded. For my visual learners, however, we have two graphs. The first, on the left, contains the coefficients for the cross-level interactions of the public sphere gender equality measures with student gender. The second, on the right, for the domestic sphere gender equality measures. The left column in each graph represents the models estimated without controls for societal inequalities. The right column represents the results of the estimations including controls for societal inequalities. In both cases, I am presenting the absolute values of the coefficients. Why absolute values? Because the concept of amplification really means this thing increased in magnitude. Discussing this with positive and negative values can become convoluted, but the visual representation of the phenomenon when using absolute values is very straightforward. If the lines go up, associations are amplified. If the lines go down, associations are suppressed. So when examining younger children, here grade 4, we found that controlling for societal inequalities was detrimental to the association between public gender equality and the gender gap in mathematics. Not only with regard to the magnitude of the associations, but indeed as to whether they were statistically significant or not. In other words, among younger children, and with the exception of the gender gap index, public gender equality appeared to act more as a proxy for societal inequality than it did as a motivator of the gender gap in mathematics. Domestic gender equalities, however, were amplified by controlling for societal inequalities. So, to summarize, societal inequalities do appear to amplify gender inequalities in younger students, just not the way the existing literature would have us expect. In fact, societal inequalities appear to amplify the association between domestic sphere gender equalities and the gender gap in mathematics among younger students. For older students, in grade 8, societal inequalities did not seem to really amplify either public or domestic sphere inequalities, although they did still contribute to explaining the gender gap. But what does all of this mean? Well, we view this as the first step in a serious examination of socialization theory as a meaningful alternative, or at the very least, a very necessary supplement to gender stratification theory. It is a signpost to a route to escape the theoretical monopoly that gender stratification theory has had on examinations of the gender gap in mathematics for more than 3 decades. And one might say at the least, but we would argue possibly more significantly, it has provided us with a deeper understanding of gender inequality in achievement. That in turn gives us the means to take the first steps towards removing yet another structural impediment related to gender, which allows us to approach increased equality in both educational and later status attainment. And that is equivalent to increasing overall societal equality. And an equal society is by necessity and definition an integrated society. Now I say all that knowing full well that no study, ours included, is perfect. There are clear limitations to our work. We do need to look at a more expansive perspective on these issues. Our sample is quite limited in size from a theoretical perspective, and we would absolutely love replication across more samples, more contexts, and of course even younger children if we could find relevant databases with the right kind of data. However, on the back of these findings, these initial findings, this first step, we are currently at the white paper stage for the more in-depth, more comprehensive examination of socialization as a viable mechanism to explain the gender gap in mathematics. Thank you very much for your attention and your time. I have again been Michael Katsillis, and together with Romain Delès, we have been working on this for months and months and months. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you want to discuss it with us, please feel free. Don't hesitate to get in touch with one or both of us. We would love to hear from you. Thank you yet again, and have a wonderful day.